You guys good? Somebody say good. Thank you, sir. Thanks, Jeremiah. What a guy. What a guy, right? Hey, who's excited for one conference? Come on. Hey, if you still need to register for one conference, can I encourage you? Do it as soon as you can so we can start making plans for food and all the great things that we're going to have. Hey, listen. Night one of one conference, I booked an American Ninja Warrior course. Let's go. Anyone think they got some American Ninja skills? Can you get up the warp wall? Can you get up the warp wall? Sam can get up the warp wall. Yeah, he can. Carson knows. Well, tonight, guys, we're going to be jumping into just a one-off message. This isn't a series, but I want to preach to you a message. I want to preach to you a message called "The Power of a Made-Up Mind." The power of a made-up mind. And so we're going to talk for just a few minutes just about this idea. Specifically, I want to just kind of start with just this idea of being rescued, because I think being rescued is really cool, right? Like when you see like a rescue, typically it's somebody like out in the middle of the Indian Ocean, right? And it's like helicopters come flying in, and it's like some Coast Guard dude in a wetsuit, and he's like, "Take my hand," and they're like, like reaching up. And or they got one of those like orange buoys, you know what I'm talking about? Like, they throw the little orange buoy out and they're like hanging off it, like they're barely getting up to the helicopter. And it's one of those things where I think about that and I'm like, wow, that's so cool. Like, I love rescues. I love seeing that. It's awesome. But then I start to really think about it and I'm like, all right, hold on. How did this dude end up floating through the Indian Ocean, like hanging on a piece of scrap wood surrounded by man-eating sharks? Like how did he get from wherever he was before to the being there? Like, what's the back? Anyone ever wonder that? Like, what is the backstory? You like see a headline in the news, it's like woman eaten by dog, and you're like, what is the backstory here? Okay, like, what kind of dog is this? Number one, was it really a wolf? Like, what's the secret here? Like, I want to know the backstory. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to kind of jump into just a little bit of a backstory and some context, because here's the deal. The reason that we want to know the backstory is because we want to know the context so that we can more thoroughly appreciate the rescue. Because it's cool to be rescued, but it's really cool when you understand what you're being rescued from, and it's really cool when you understand the context of what got them into that specific situation. Anybody with me? Cool? So before we dive into the text that we're going to look at tonight, I just want to hit the pause button, give you a little background information on the story that we're going to read. And so here's the context. The year is approximately 605 BC, okay? This is a long time ago. King Nebuchadnezzar is one of the main figures we're going to be looking at. He's the king of Babylon, which is also now known as like modern-day Iraq, okay? And so he's the king of Babylon, and he goes into Jerusalem, and he starts just tearing up the city. Like he's just making a mess. Like he shows up, besieges the city, things are starting to get bad, and when he invades the city, he actually takes back thousands of captives, thousands of people back to his home place of Babylon, right? So he goes to Jerusalem, takes all their stuff, goes to the temple of God, and actually takes things from the temple of God and brings them back and puts those things in his own false god or idol's temple. And so he's openly mocking God. And he mocks him by also taking captive his people. But he's a smart guy. Like, he's obviously a fairly smart guy, because he knew that he couldn't just like be as influential as he wanted to be, because listen, they're captives, right? You don't want to listen to the guy, the jerk that took you captive. And so what he does is he picks some people from the captives. He actually takes some of the captives and looks for people that are fairly beautiful people, handsome people that are smart, or that are extremely talented, or are people that would be influential. And so he takes these people and he actually says, you know what I need to do is I need to train them. And so what I'm going to do is he chooses 4 men, and one of them was Daniel. Everyone knows the story of like Daniel, right? So Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These are 4 dudes that are captives from Judah. And there are 4 people that he chooses out of this group of captives to try to influence and lead the other captives. Cool? So this wasn't a bad plan. Like, he's pretty smart, but he knew if these people were going to be influential for him, he was going to have to strip away who they were. Because right now, they are people from Judah, from Jerusalem. These are people that look like them, that have names that represent them. And so he knew what I'm going to need to do is strip away these things. So he really tries to go after their personal identity, their national identity, and ultimately their religious identity. And let me tell you how he did it. He went to rename them. Because here's the deal. Daniel, the name Daniel actually means God is my judge. And he was renamed to Belshazzar, which is like a super weird name, number one. But it was a false god. It was an idol. And so they named him after this false god, this idol. And so they started to just actually attack him in that way. Hananiah, which meant God has been gracious, was renamed Shadrach, which means under the command of Aku, which is one of their false idols, their deities. So literally one by one, they go from Azariah to Mishael, all these people, and they start to strip away their meanings, because Mishael means who is what God is, and Azariah means he that hears the Lord. And so these names aren't just names, guys. Like back in this time, like in biblical times, names carried not just meaning, but they carried identity. They carried faith statements about who these people were and what their parents wanted for them and what their parents felt God had said over them. And so what Nebuchadnezzar did is he renamed them. He labeled them in an attempt to demean them. Anyone ever been labeled? Anyone ever had someone try to put something on you that wasn't yours? Anyone ever have someone try to take away who you were created to be, your identity, and try to say who you should be? I think we all have in some way or another. But the Babylonians took these young men, they changed these powerful names, these powerful declarations about God, really, and stripped that away and began to make them identify with these idols, with these deities. And so they labeled them. But these young men, they refused to live by the labels that they had been given. See, here's the deal. Like, while they were labeled, they still knew who they were. And so they actually refused to even eat the things that the king ate, because the food and the wine had been offered to these idols, these false gods. And so they said, listen, I'm not even going to eat that stuff. Like, give me vegetables and water, which you're desperate when you start asking for vegetables. Give me vegetables and water. It's like, what do you say? But like, they're eating steak and they're eating all these nice things and they're having fine wine, and they're like, hey, we're not going to defile ourselves with this food that's been offered to these idols. So they're living for their faith. They're living from their convictions still. And here's the deal. Like, they refused to live by the label that their enemy had given them. The thing is it didn't matter what other people called them or what other people tried to say over them, because listen, Daniel knew that God was still his judge. Like Hananiah knew that God was still gracious. Mishael knew that he was created in the image of God, and Azariah knew that he still heard God. Even though that wasn't their name, it was stripped from them, they knew that on the inside you can't take that away. That you can't take away someone's identity. And so what I want you guys to hear is you don't have to live by the labels that people put on you. Like, you don't have to live by those things. You can stand firm in knowing who you are called to be. And the enemy may call you forgotten, but in John 15, God calls you chosen. He says, no, I chose you. Like, the enemy may call you lonely, but God said in Deuteronomy that he would never leave you or forsake you. Like, the enemy may speak over you, may try to put a lie in your brain that says you're not good enough, not smart enough, but God has promised you wisdom and knowledge beyond your years. This is something that's attainable in him. He says, ask and you'll receive wisdom. Like, the enemy may call you worthless, but God says you're worth everything, and that's why he sent Jesus to die for you so you could be made right with God. And so here's the deal. This was the first time, this moment when they refused to eat the king's food. They refused to bow to the culture that they lived in. And so that was the first time, and we're going to jump right into the second time, because here's the second time that this happens. In Daniel chapter 3, we see kind of the next temptation they face. King Nebuchadnezzar creates this, like I'm telling you, this guy was like, he was crazy, okay? He creates a giant gold statue of who? Himself. He's like, man, I am so good looking. I'm going to make this big gold statue. It's going to be incredible. And he builds this huge statue of him. And he's like, you know what? That's not good enough. I don't want to just have a statue of me. I want them to worship the statue of me. And so he makes this decree, not a suggestion, a legal binding decree, and says, hey, whenever you hear the flute, the trumpet, the lyre, these instruments, you're going to have to actually bow down and worship me. Now listen, that means everyone in Babylon. Every single person, when they hear this, the instruments, they're supposed to bow down and worship him. And if you refused, if someone did not bow down, the punishment was these people were going to be thrown into a fiery furnace. a fiery, like they were going to be burned alive simply because they didn't bow down to a statue. So that's the question. Are these guys going to honor God? Are they going to stand for their convictions? Or are they going to bow to culture? So Daniel chapter 3 is where we are today. Verse 8 through 18, it says this. Open up your Bibles if you would. Daniel chapter 3, 8 through 18. I have it on the screen. It says, "But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. And they said to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, 'Long live the king. You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into the blazing furnace.' Verse 12 says, 'But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue that you set up.'" It says this, "Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. And when they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, 'Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or worship the gold statue I set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I made when you hear the sound of the instruments. But if you refuse, you will be immediately thrown into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?' Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, 'O Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God who we serve is able to save us, and he will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you have set up.'" The title of my message tonight is simply "The Power of a Made Up Mind." Would you pray with me? Jesus, thank you so much for every one of these students in the room. God, I pray that you would speak to them. God, I pray that tonight they would be encouraged. God, I pray that small groups would be fruitful tonight, that people will be able to open up and build real, authentic, and true community. God, we love you so much, and we're so grateful. In Jesus' name, somebody say amen. Amen. Well, on October 4th, 1957, the Russians sent out a satellite called Sputnik, which actually is a word that's Russian for traveler. And they sent this satellite into orbit, and this was the very first satellite that was ever sent into space. And this came as a shock to many Americans who were not very happy about this, because this is in the middle of the Cold War. Like, this is in the middle of just like a crazy geopolitical showdown of trying to see who's most powerful and who has the best tech and who's going to get to space first. It's a space race. And really, like, honestly, this was a really upsetting thing for America, because America, like, let's be honest. All right, we got Americans in the room. We don't like to be seen as behind, right? We don't like to be seen as lacking, all right? Like we don't like to be looking like we're not as advanced or we're not cutting edge. And so literally, like, America at this time viewed space as like the next frontier. Like, this was the only unexplored place left, was space. It was the next great frontier, and they wanted to go and get ahead because the Russians were taking ground in this area. And so, like, if you think about America, like adventure, wilderness, exploration, like, it is woven into the very fabric, the very DNA of our nation, right? Like, just think about like the Louisiana Purchase. Come on, anybody learn about that in school? Lewis and Clark, like going west to the Rockies, right? Like we're like, look at us pioneers out here. But like, this is part of America, like exploration and adventure. And so this fired up America, and we're like, no way are we going to let Russia beat us to space. And so we go into this mode, right, where we started to say, you know what, like, we're going after this thing. And it really is just a grand adventure of exploration awaiting there for us in space. And so what happened was, America basically said, heck no. Like, America's like, no, like, this ain't happening. We're going to win this race. So in 1958, we launched our own satellite called the Explorer 1. Why? Because America's number one. Come on, somebody. Hoorah. Like, yeah, there we go. 4th of July coming up. Thank you, Carson, in the back there, for that very strong clap. Like, America's number one, right? So they called it Explorer number one. They're like, Sputnik? What is Sputnik anyways? That's not the first satellite. Explorer number one, all right? We win. Like, we just started making changes, and actually that same year we created NASA. Shout out to my man Jason, what up? But like, we created NASA that same year. And in 1961, President John F. Kennedy, he made this bold public proclamation that by the end of the decade, we were gonna put a man on the moon. Come on, that's cool. And so we're like, all right, like America, man, like, yeah, let's go. And so we get ready, and it actually ends up happening. And on July 16th of 1969, U.S. astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins set off on the Apollo 11 space mission. I wonder why they call it the Apollo 11. Maybe Jason could tell us, because did they crash 1 through 10? Like, maybe? Basically, he says, one crashed. So they just skipped right to 11. They're like, you know what, let's not even try 2 through 10. Let's just go right to Apollo 11. So the Apollo 11 space mission was the first lunar landing attempt, right? This is pretty cool. And after landing successfully on the moon on July 20th, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon's surface. And he famously called the moment, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But listen, that giant leap came from the power of a made-up mind. America, John F. Kennedy, these people had made up their mind that we were going to put someone on the moon, and we did it. That giant leap came from the power of a made-up mind. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, listen, they had made up their minds. They had made a decision, and they said to them, look, let me just read this again. Verse 17, 18 says, if we are thrown into a blazing furnace, the God who we serve is able to save us, and he will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it very clear to you, your majesty, that we will never bow down and worship the idol or the gold statue that you have set up. Like listen, they had already made up their minds that for if whatever reason that God didn't come through, if for whatever reason that God didn't show up, they still wouldn't bow. They still weren't going to submit. They still weren't going to serve this false idol, this gold statue that had been set up, even under the threat of death, the threat of being thrown alive into a flaming, burning furnace. They still wouldn't bow, and they still would not compromise. Listen, so I want you to hear this, young people. Stop bowing. Stop bowing to culture. Stop compromising. Stop giving in these areas, because listen, I'm telling you, it's not going to end up well. Like it's so easy to compromise. It's so easy to bow. It's so easy to stand among the trees, like we talked about last week. It's easy to blend in. Listen, it's hard to stand up when nobody else is. It's hard to stand up for what's right when everybody else seems to be doing something contrary. Like when everyone else is on the ground and you're the only one in the crowd standing up, you feel exposed, you feel vulnerable. But listen, God honors that moment. Listen, culture says sleep with whoever, whenever, it doesn't matter. But God says sex is a sacred gift that he has reserved for marriage. It's powerful. Like culture says, follow your heart, but God says, hey, don't follow your heart, follow me. Follow me. Don't follow your heart. Culture says find temporary peace in drugs and alcohol and these other things, but God says, hey, if you follow me, you're going to find everlasting peace that will never leave you. This is a peace that sustains. Like culture says, quit when the going gets tough. Like just quit. But God says, my grace is sufficient for you to get through anything. Whatever you're going through, I can help you get through it. That is what God says. And at some point in your life, you have to make a decision to take a stand. You just have to come to this place when you actually choose, you know what, even though everybody else is bowing down, I'm going to stand, and even if it costs me something, even if it costs me being embarrassed or exposed, even if it costs me being thrown into the flames of whatever that problem or situation is, I'm going to stand up for God, and I'm going to stand up for what's right. So picking back up in the story where we left off, Daniel chapter 3, verse 19 through 25. So the second part of this story, chapter 3, verse 19 through 25, it says this. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. Come on, some of you seen your moms like that. He don't tell her I said that. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual, right? And then he ordered some of the strongest men to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, their turbans, their robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded, listen to this, such a hot fire that it actually killed the soldiers as they were throwing in these men. So they hit this fire, they get it steaming so hot that as they go to throw them into it, it literally kills the soldiers that were meant to just throw them in. That's a hot fire, okay? Flaming hot fire. Okay, so the fire. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, they fall into the roaring flames. And it's like, let's just end the story right there. That's really sad. Like, rest in peace, you know what I mean? But like, that's not what happens. It says in verse 24, it says, but suddenly, everyone say suddenly. Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, yo, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the fire? Didn't we tie up 3 guys? Yes, your majesty, we certainly did, they replied. And he says this, look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted, I see 4 men, unbound, walking around the flames. And the 4th looks like a god. The 4th looks like a god. Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door in the flaming furnace. And he shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they stepped out of the fire, and then the high officers, the officials, the governors, the advisors, they all crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and even their clothing wasn't scorched. Listen, they didn't even smell like smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's commands and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god but their own. So here's the deal. The enemy can flash his flames at you all he wants, but when you have your mind made up, that I'm going to stand for God, that I'm going to honor him, that I'm going to live for him, that I'm going to live by conviction and not by culture, that I'm going to stand for him even when no one else is. Listen, they can throw you into the fire, but I'm letting you know right now, you're not going to get burned and you're not even going to smell like smoke. You're going to come out on the other side and you're not going to be burned. Listen, people are going to look at you and say, listen, how did you go through that? How did you go through all that junk? How did you go through all that stuff that you went through and not even get burned? You came out on the other side and you're not even angry. You're not even bitter. You're not even mad. How did you come through that and actually have faith in God? How did you walk through that pain and come out on the other side and still be serving and still be joyful and still be in a place of rest and still be in a place of peace? How can you go through that and you'll be able to just look at them and say, because I wasn't alone in the fire, because my God never left me. Because he promised me that he would never leave me and never forsake me, even in the hard times, even in the moments when I'm thrown into the flames. My God promised me that he would be there with me because Jesus was the 4th man in the fire, standing there with them, protecting them, walking with them. And I'm telling you, when you're in the flames, when you're in the highest moment of pain and trouble and torment, I'm letting you know there's another in the fire that will never leave you, that will never forsake you, and that loves you. You're going to be able to say, I wasn't alone during my parents' divorce. I wasn't alone when that loved one died. I wasn't alone when I was addicted to drugs. I wasn't alone when I was stuck in this place of depression. I wasn't alone, and I made it through it, and I don't even smell like smoke. I don't have after effects. I don't have things that are holding on to me. I don't have chains. I don't have bondage that's hanging on to me because there was another in the fire that unbound me, that set me free, and that protected me from the flames. Listen, Jesus will always be there for you. He's there for you. And he'll never leave you. Even if you try to run away, he will pursue you. Because that's who he is. His love will chase you down, so don't even try to get away. Because his love will find you. In your darkest moments, in your lowest moments, when you feel like nobody else could ever love you, his love will find you even there.